Today's presentation is Risk Profile for Reservoir Dredging. It's going to be given by Sritama, Sarkar, the Principal Subsea and Pipeline Engineer at ABL Group. A little bit about Sritama. Sritama is a chartered engineer with nearly 20 years of working experience in dredging, subsea vehicle design and offshore industry. In her current role as a marine warranty surveyor at ABL Group, she manages deep water offshore oil and gas projects. She is involved with dredging and trenching activities associated with offshore oil and gas and renewable projects. Sritama is one of the technical members of the World Organization of Dredging Associations, Reservoir Dredging Working Group. She has also published various papers on dredging and deep sea mining. Sritama is a chartered engineer and a member of RINA. So she'll give her presentation and will respond to any questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to swing the camera around to Sritama, who will take us through her presentation.
Thank you very much, Keith. Very good evening to everyone in the room and everyone who has joined us for this evening. So, as Keith mentioned, I will be presenting on risk profile for reservoir dredging, and I'm very thankful to RINA for giving me the opportunity to present this on today's evening. So, when developing the risk profile for reservoir dredging, the first thing you need to know is the reservoir definition and the classification, and the second one is the sedimentation pattern within the reservoir and the material presented inside the reservoir. Once you have idea of those two, then you develop a sediment management and removal strategy. There are various options of sediment management and removal strategies, and always the ecology should be taken into consideration. And what I'm considering today is just dredging as an option for sediment management and removal strategy from reservoirs. So once you know dredging is the chosen option, then why do we need a risk profile for reservoir dredging? Secondly, we want to know who are the stakeholders for the reservoir dredging activities, how you do the risk management for the various phases of the life cycle of the reservoir dredging activities, and the risk assessment for those. And then finally, how you integrate all those with the risk tolerance for the contractors, the dredging contractors. So that's basically what I will be talking through in my presentation today. Firstly, how we define a reservoir. So I have taken the reservoir definition from the National Geographic, and it says it can be any artificial lake which can be storing water, and most of the reservoirs are formed by constructing dams across the rivers. But a reservoir can be from a natural lake whose outlet can be dammed to control the water level. So throughout my presentation, whenever I say reservoir, I'm considering both man-made as well as natural reservoirs. Just an overview of reservoir classification. The origin, as I already mentioned, it can be natural or man-made. The size of reservoir, it varies from country to country. Some countries use the storage volume, some the surface area, width or depth or length of the reservoir. Just as an example, I have taken the standard used in India. So in India, the reservoirs are classified small for area less than 10 square kilometer, medium area between 10 to 50 square kilometer, and large reservoirs area greater than 50 square kilometer. The position of the reservoir and the location of the reservoir is very important in terms of defining the material characteristics. So depending on the position and the location, the type of material which is presented within the reservoir varies. So for the position, it can be valley dammed. So it's in the mountainous region where the reservoir is between the valleys. The bank side, where already water from rivers are taken into a reservoir or an existing reservoir. And coastal, it's very close to the coast as it's evident from there. The purpose can be flood control or hydroelectric generation. It can be specifically for domestic, agricultural, or pisciculture purposes. It can be for municipal or industrial purposes, or for tourism purposes, or creating habitat for birds and animals. The location as is very important in terms of the material characteristics, as I already mentioned. So the location can be in wet or arid zone. The cold zone reservoirs, the most challenging thing is in the cold regions, the vegetation can be in the summer months, and that creates a problem of reservoir sediment removal. It can be in the plain land or hilly region, can be in rural or urban areas, or surrounded by trees or no trees at all. And again, if depending on where it's present, whether it's rural or urban areas, there can be material which can be thrown into the reservoirs, which adds to the material present in the reservoir. If there are lots of trees, the leaves from the trees or the branches from the trees can fall into the reservoir, and these causes additional challenges for dredging activities. This slide just shows us a schematic, and it's not to scale, of the sedimentation profile for a reservoir. So the words which are written in red, those are all the processes which you can find in a reservoir area. So the inflow can be the water from the surrounding streams, and the inflow can be water as well as different types of sediments. The seepage depends on the type of bedrock, how porous the rock is, whether there will be enough seepage. Then there is evaporation and precipitation, which depends where the area where the reservoir is located. And again, the precipitation and the rate of evaporation can be varying from season to season, and that controls the amount of coming and the water velocity inside the reservoir. The left-hand side is a Yule-Strom diagram, which is the fundamental of relating the velocity profile within the reservoir to the particle size. So depending on how the water velocity profile is within the reservoir and the particle size, the particle can either be eroded or it can be transported or deposited. So here, at the beginning, where the deltaic region is, the water is quite high, and then you get the velocity is quite high, and you get the big, the gravel, cobble, and sand size particles here. As you move along, then you get finer sediments towards the end of the reservoir where the dam is. This one, I took it from Gregory Morris's paper, and this shows the sedimentation profile along the reservoir life cycle. So at the very beginning, where A, that's when the reservoir is built, and there's hardly any sediment at that point. As you go farther along, this one, D, is the final, where all the storage of the reservoir is compromised, and there's coarse sediments here and fine sediments at the bottom. And this can cause reduction of the purpose for which the reservoir is built, and also can cause structural damage to the dams, and ultimately failure of the dams, leading to flood risks and loss of human lives and other associated resources. So to know the material characterization within the reservoir is very, very important. And as I mentioned, all the processes which are prevalent for a reservoir that needs to be considered. So the sediments, so for the material, I have divided it into sediments, contaminants, and aquatic plants. These are the three main groups of material which you can find in a reservoir. So the sediment Piank classification is a very well-known classification in the dredging world, and that classification can be used for reservoir classification purposes as well. The sediment source can be generated from the erosion of the bank, or can be transported by water, or can be waste disposal from nearby communities. And this is a big problem for quite a lot of countries. I will show some pictures later on, which show some of the waste disposed there. It can be transported by wind or water. Now, coming to the contaminants, it can be either natural contaminants, which is coming from the subsoil. So some places of the world, the rocks have arsenic, and that arsenic can be contaminating the water of the reservoir, and also later on to some extent of the soil as well. The contaminants can be eroded and transported again from the bedrock or from a different region. The artificial contaminants, basically, it's all the material which is thrown by the surrounding community, especially the human beings. So in some places that can be washing or bathing the cattle. It's unusual here, but that's quite common in a lot of countries. So industrial effluents and solids, and also lots of countries have religious rituals from which wastes are also generated that can go into the reservoirs. The aquatic plants can be of different types. Some can be free-floating or attached, or some can be semi-aquatic. And as I mentioned, the aquatic plants, especially for subarctic regions or reservoirs, is very important because the vegetation which is there, which is either coming into the reservoir or on the site, gets partially decomposed and thawed during different seasons. And that's a big challenge for any dredging activities. In my previous slide, so the picture on the left shows a stream coming into a big reservoir, transporting the material. The waste disposal, as you can see here, and this is a real picture, it's not Photoshop, so there can be anything in this waste, and this can go into the reservoir itself, and it's a big challenge to tackle these kind of wastes. The one at the very bottom, that's from the banking ocean. If you look at this carefully, it's not a very good picture, but all the banks it's eroded, and that material goes directly into the reservoir. Just some of the plants which can be found. So now we know a bit about the reservoir classification and the type of material which are present in the reservoirs. How do we tackle that problem? So there can be a preventive sediment management problem, preventive sediment management, or there can be curative sediment management as well. So preventive management is you're controlling the sediment at the source. So how you can do it, you can either create embankments or sediment traps, or you plant different trees which can resist the erosion of the soil. Also, you can control the sediment while it's transported. So you can construct pre-settling structures, some weirs or small dams and barrages upstream. You can create silt traps as well. The other one is the contaminants. If it's natural contaminant in the subsoil, it is quite difficult to control because you cannot change the subsoil. If it's on the reservoir sediments, then you can use processes like trapping or encapsulation using different geotextile to encapsulate the sediment and transport it in a controlled manner. Artificial contaminants, this is basically what is coming from the people living near the reservoirs. You can either have legal notices barring certain activities. You can take legal actions against industrial effluents and solids disposal from the industry. Or sometimes you can have some social pressure or from the NGOs who are active in the local area to stop these kind of activities, resulting in unnecessary polluting the reservoirs. The curative sediment management, it can be either for very small reservoirs, manual extension is possible during the dry season. It's not very cost effective and it's a bit slow process, but that's an option for very small reservoirs in certain areas specifically. You can also use land-based excavation if the reservoir is dried up or there's a lot of sedimentation within the reservoir. You can use land excavators to excavate the soil. And the one on the left, that's basically this dredger is working in a reservoir from where drinking water in a city in India is being carried out. So it's very sensitive in terms of the pollutants generated over there. And it's a very special type of cutter as well. I'll talk a bit later about that as well. Now, when you're using dredging, the other thing which needs to be considered is to consider about the circular economy. So you don't waste the dredged spoil. Think of options where the dredged spoils can be used for certain beneficial functions. Showing some of the different types of dredges which can be used for reservoirs. So there are cutter suction dredges which can be used for reservoir dredgers. There can be plain or jet suction dredges where basically you use high pressure jets to dislodge the sediment and then use a pump to suck it up and transport it. You can have mechanical dredges like clamshell, grab, or backhoe, or which can be on pontoons. Airlift dredges, it's not very common, but this is also one of the techniques. So essentially, you use compressed air to bring it down on the bottom on where the suction mouth is, and you use the air to push the solids up. Just showing two specialized cutters. One is the auger cutter. This is specifically used for places where there's contaminated sediments. So you can use this where the depth of cut is very shallow, so you don't spread the contamination from the place where you are cutting to the surrounding areas. So this is known as surgical cutting in dredging terms as well, not what you would think in a medical term, but that's also a term which we use in dredging. The other one, which I showed before, it's a rotavator cutter. So this area, this particular reservoir, has a lot of weeds. So this rotavator cutter, it has the capability to cut the weeds and also then later on use some other type of specialized cutter to tackle the sediments. The other type, which is very prevalent in reservoirs, is water injection dredging. So here, the principle of density current is used. So by density current, you have a certain natural flow, and then there's a difference in the amount of sediment on one side to another. You try to transport the sediment with the natural flow using the density current principle. Some of the other technologies which are also looked upon, these are not standard dredgers as you saw before, but this is a submersible pump with the drive integrated with the system itself. This is from IHC and it's a TT pump series. So basically there's a cutter which is this black one, and the other picture has just a suction mouth. So you can dislodge the material and suck it up and pump it ashore. And these pumps usually are lowered by a winch system. So it doesn't move very effectively as a normal dredger, but it's very good in using in places where the big dredgers can't go or where you have very restricted areas to go. The one at the bottom, the blue one, that's Tiamat. This is from Haven Dredging in the UK. And they're using this technique now to do tests as well in the Haven port. So here also two pumps, submersible pumps with drives are used to dislodge the material using jetting. And then big pump, that's also a submersible pump, is used to transport the material using the density current principle. And they're using it in the port of Haven as well. So they're doing tests on that. The one on the right, this is a special type of pump. It's known as an annular dredge pump. This whole system can be, again, winched up and down, and this has no moving part. The motive force is water, and the drive is on top of the boat or the pontoons. This is showing some tests. So you can see big cobbles which were taken up by this pump, as well as a mixture of sediment and different types of weeds. It was all handled by this pump, and there's some jetting associated with it as well. Some more technologies. So the other one where depth becomes more and more for the reservoirs, you can use remote controlled submersible dredgers. So submersible crawlers, which basically has oars like the tracks. Then this one is a walking dredger. So this can walk on different types of soil. Or you can also have a floating submersible dredger as well. So now we have covered most of the technologies which can be used. So now the main question is, why do we need a risk profile for reservoir dredging? So the main challenges for reservoir dredging, I showed the classification of reservoirs. I say that this can be the purpose, but most of the time, in a reservoir, it's a multiple use reservoir. So there are multiple uses from the single reservoir, leading to potential conflicts between the various stakeholders. There's always very complex and sensitive ecosystems associated with any reservoir. So that's another challenge. Quite a lot of reservoirs are located in very remote areas with no good access road. So transportation and launching of the dredgers and equipment, because you might not have the relevant cranes required to launch the dredgers. So that's another challenge. The disposal of the dredge material for reservoirs is a big concern. because reservoirs are landlocked water bodies, so where you dispose the dredged material. Again, the sedimentation management and restoration involves the public resources, so they have a lot of say on how this should be done, whether they will be affected or not. Which brings to the next slide, that who are the stakeholders for reservoir dredging. So the stakeholders are the one who care about or have a vested interest on the project itself, whereas the decision makers, they are the legal authority, or they have the accountability or some management action. So all decision makers, they are stakeholders for reservoir dredging, but not all stakeholders are decision makers. And most of the big projects, we know if it's a stakeholder-driven process, if the stakeholders are involved from the initial project planning, then it's effective in mitigating the risks. So that's the same with reservoir dredging activity as well. Now, this is a table showing the potential stakeholders for any reservoir dredging activities. The second column shows how the likelihood that the stakeholder will affect the decision. So whether the stakeholder has any effect on the decision itself. And the third column is how the reservoir dredging activity is affecting the stakeholder. And then this is the different phases of the reservoir dredging life cycle. I will show this in a later slide as well. But the main stakeholders for any reservoir dredging are the end users or the consumers who actually use the reservoir for various purposes. The different non-governmental organizations, so they usually have very low input to reservoir dredging decisions, and they are also not affected by the reservoir activity. You have natural resource management agencies, so like local environmental agencies. Their decision, they can have a effect on the decision for reservoir dredging activities, but they are not affected. The main people who are affected are the subcontractor and the contractor, so they have a high in making the decision, and also they will be affected, and that's for all the phases of the reservoir dredging activities. So now the risk management and the risk response. As I mentioned, the reservoir dredging life cycle. So it starts from the pre-tendering phase, and then the tendering phase, the mobilization and site setup, the execution phase, and the site restoration phase and demop phase. Now, most of the time when we talk about risk management or risk mitigation, we are primarily concerned about the execution phases. But I will show that even during the pre-tendering phase or tendering phase, there are risks which, if not taken care at the time, can create that risk gets transferred as well. So it's very important to identify these different phases of the reservoir dredging cycle and identify the risks associated with each of the phases. So just to categorize again, what type of risk can you find for reservoir dredging activities? The main headings can be a technical risk, it can be an economic, a commercial risk, it can be an organizational risk, which is basically related to the company itself. It can be a political risk, and especially some countries, the political risk can be quite high, or it can be a social risks. So all these on the left-hand side, those are the risks, that's the cause. And then the effect is, it can affect on the dredging objectives, thereby affecting the scope of the dredging work, the schedule, the cost, and the quality of the work. There can be more than one or more causes acting to generate the risk, and one or more stakeholders can also be affected from these risks. Just to give some examples of what I mean by the different types of risks. So the technical, it's very it's very easy to understand. It can be the equipment risk, so you don't choose the correct equipment. The R&D, which are necessary for choosing the right type of methodology, dredging process, or dredging equipment itself. the operability, reliability of the equipment chosen, the quality of the equipment chosen, those all can be technical risks. The economic risks is the financial management system for the whole project, the cash flow of both the contractor as well as the company, the cost and revenue, and the loss generated from those activities. The commercial, it mainly comes from the contracting part of the project. So whether the contracts are written correctly, whether the marketing and legal department has done the due diligence, whether the procurement has been done properly. So all those things can generate your commercial risks. Organizational risks, whoever is the company or the contractor, the structure. So whether the structure of the company is such that the decision is passed on effectively, the policies and procedures of the company as well as the contractor, that's all big risks to the whole project. Then political. So this has nothing with the contractor or the company, but it's basically the local governance, the stakeholders, the regulations. If you're exporting the equipment from one country to another, what are the export rules? Those all comes under the political risks. The social, how is the social condition of the people around and how they will behave to the reservoir dredging activity, or in general, how they will behave when the reservoir is there. So those are the various type of risks. Now, once you identify your risks, you have to develop a risk management and response system for the project. So you identify the risk related to each phase of the dredging, reservoir dredging cycle. You categorize the risk based on the 6 headings, which I showed before. You analyze the risk, how much risk it is. You evaluate the risk, so how that risk is going to affect your organization or the project itself. You plan your risk responses and you implement the risk responses. It doesn't stop there. You continuously monitor. Any risk management process has to be continuously monitored. So that needs to be done, and again, feedback to continue with the process. So it's a continuous process throughout the whole life cycle of the dredging. So the aim is to reduce the likelihood of an identified risk, but the potential risk on the project itself. So the risk response, the bullet points for this is, you take the action to reduce the probability of a threat arising or to reduce its impact if it arises at all. So that's the aim of your risk management development. You take proactive responses or mitigations, and these are usually funded from your project budget. So you know that these things can go wrong. So you already budget it within your project budget. So those things can be taken care of. Then the reactive responses. So if something happens, you have to react to that risk. And these are sudden decisions. So those interventions or responses comes from the contingency budget of the reservoir dredging project. When you are developing your tender documents or when you are budgeting everything, the contingency budget is very important to be thought of from the very initial days. So now, how you do a risk assessment for reservoir dredging. This is for any risk assessment, whoever in our audience is involved with risk assessment, we know that there are standards. So the BS OSAS 18101, that's 18,001, sorry, that has now been replaced by ISO 45001. And the ISO 14001, that's the environmental management system. So these two are the fundamental for carrying out any risk assessment. So the risk assessment process, again, I'm just probably repeating, but just showing it. So you identify the reservoir dredging activities, you list the hazards, the related hazards for the different activities. You have standard controls and reduction measures in place, and you give a risk rating with control measures. So all these risks or hazards can affect the people, can affect the equipment or the environment and the reputation of the company. If there is any consequence of the hazard on the equipment, it can affect the schedule, the quality or the cost of the whole project. So this is any standard risk assessment process, but just to show in context of reservoir dredging. You develop a consequence table for reservoir dredging. So what are the damage or the impact to the personnel or the people, to the environment, and the asset damage and downtime. Now, most important is the asset damage and downtime. So I have given some basic ideas about the financial loss and the downtime. So this again varies from company to company or from country to country. So this is just a guideline. You develop the likelihood of it's very likely or possible or very unlikely, and you develop the risk rating for each of the hazards. So you get a table like this, which is for any risk profile for any activity. So now I will show some of the examples when I was saying that when we talk about risk management, people mostly think during the execution phase. But even for pre-tendering phase, there are hazards related to different activities, which can give a huge amount of risk to the overall project itself. So for an example, if you determine the sediment volume, distribution and classification as one of the pre-tendering activities, and you get inadequate or wrong survey data, and that can affect your technical, economical, or commercial. Because technical, then you can choose an equipment which is not adequate for the purpose. That can then affect your cost, and hence economical and commercial risks can come. And the people who will be affected, or the stakeholders who will be affected, are the company who is executing the dredging or who has asked for reservoir dredging activity, and the contractor and the subcontractor. Again, the same goes for if the dredge scope is defined wrongly, then the same type of risks will be there. You identify a disposal location, which is not, when you go for the initial reconnaissance survey and you don't find a suitable disposal area, and you don't mention that, then that's another risk. And the most important thing during the pre-tendering phase is defining the liability period of dredging. So quite often for dredging works, people say, oh, okay, this much material has been dredged, but then again with nature, this material has filled up. So you define a liability period for which the dredging contractor will be responsible for any sudden influx of material from the site. So that is very important clause to put in the pre-tendering phase, which then gets transferred into the tendering phase as well. Same with the tendering phase. The tendering process, if it's a very poorly written contract, and that all of us will know, if you select the wrong contractor with the wrong track record, that can be a risk. If you don't, even from the contractor side, if you don't obtain the correct information about the company, then that's again a risk on the contractor. The deliverables by the company and the contractor should be defined also properly in the tendering documents. So these are just examples, and depending on various projects, this can change. But as I said, that the risks should be considered even starting from the pre-tendering phase and not just only the execution phase of the reservoir dredging activity. The site setup, again, you collect wrong data. You don't have the supporting equipment like electrical connection where the dredging needs to be done. So all those things needs to be looked into. This is just a table to show how you can do reservoir dredging hazard and risk rating. So this is just a template. So you have different phases of the reservoir dredging activities, different phases of the reservoir dredging. And then you have the activities, you list the hazards, effect of the hazards, you rate them, and then you control the measures. So once you do all the risk assessment for the reservoir dredging activity itself, how you integrate that with the risk tolerance of the company or the contractor or subcontractor who are actually doing the work. So each company has their own risk tolerance matrix, and the organization's risk tolerance can be the cost risk tolerance, the schedule, how much they can take, a schedule delay, the scope of the work, obviously the reputation, and the ESG. And the ESG should now always be related with the relevant United Nations SDGs. Especially for dredging, it's the life underwater is very important, and the ecology and the environment associated with the reservoir is very important to take care of. So all those things needs to be into the organization's risk tolerance matrix. And then this one needs to be compared with the risk rating of the reservoir and get a balance before you do start any reservoir dredging activity. So I think I'm nearly towards the end of my presentation. So the main points which I would like to highlight at the end of this presentation is for any reservoir dredging activity, you should have adequate knowledge of the reservoir and the ecology associated, and that is the starting point for doing any risk assessment for the reservoir dredging activity. You need to know the sedimentation pattern and the material characteristics. And even we know this, quite often in any dredging activities, we don't get adequate data about the material, and that's quite true also for quite a lot of offshore projects as well. So it's very important that we have adequate knowledge of the material characteristics present there. Identify the stakeholders associated and have an early involvement with them. Identify the disposal location, because as I mentioned that the reservoirs are located in very segregated areas. So finding a disposal location can often be a challenge, and people often live nearby. So locating a proper disposal location is very important. And how to handle the contaminated sediments if there is any, because that's a big challenge for reservoir dredging activities. And lastly, but not least, be adopted for the risk management of reservoirs. So don't take it just as a one-off problem, but look at it as a holistic approach. Look into the ecology associated with it before designing any dredging or sediment management removal strategy. So with that, that brings me to the end of my presentation.